There was no reference to this man, Muhammad. We can't find any reference to the city called Mecca. We can't find any manuscript for any book called the Quran. None of this we can find in the 7th century. But that's just silence. Where's the evidence? How do you prove evidence for something that never existed? Do you see the problem, folks? That was 1995. This is 2025, 30 years later. And everything I'm going to introduce tonight is based on evidence. We finally have the evidence.
Welcome to Events and History, where we explore the origins, teachings, and historical development of Islam with a fact-based, analytical approach. This is a continuation of Part 3, where Dr. J established that Muhammad was not a personal name but a title. If you haven't watched Part 3, you can watch it here now before watching Part 4 so you can follow along. In this Part 4, Dr. J dismantles the historical foundations of the Islamic Hadith. With years of scholarly research and debate experience, Dr. Smith examines the origins and dates attributed to the Hadiths, challenging their authenticity and exposing the gaps often overlooked in Islamic history. Using the dates of the earliest manuscripts of the Hadiths, he showed that they could never have been written by the authors attributed to them. Let's watch the show.
So folks, knowing that, let's now look and see exactly when Muhammad's story was created within Islam itself. All right? So we're not looking for Muhammad anymore. We need to look for Muhammad. That's who we need to look to. You need to go to the evidence from that century. So how well did the Muslims preserve Muhammad's story, their Muhammad story? Now we're getting back to the Muhammad of Islam, your Muhammad Abdul, okay? And Raymond's Muhammad. How well did they preserve their manuscripts? Now here's the problem. When anyone asks Muslims how they can be sure that the story they have of Muhammad is true, this one right here, this story by Ibn Hisham, they point to numerous books on their bookshelves, including this one right here, and claim that they were written by those who knew Muhammad. Did Ibn Hisham know Muhammad? No, he died in 833. That's 200 years later. He certainly did not know Muhammad. That they saw what he did and they heard what he said, but they never show us their original extant codices or their original manuscripts. Nor do they ever give us any forensically tested dates concerning when exactly those books were originally written. To be valid witnesses for Muhammad, we must have their traditional writers' original extant manuscripts. So the question I'm asking is, where is the original extant manuscript for Ibn Hisham? That's all I'm asking. That which they actually wrote. Remember, the compilers of the Prophet's life, Ibn Hisham, Al-Waqidi, and what he said, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Ibn Dawud, Tirmidhi, Ibn Najah, and Nasai, all of them were living in the caliphal courts. They were there in Baghdad. Therefore, they had all the wealth to their disposal. They did not have to depend on papyrus, like the early church fathers had to depend on. All of our Tafsir and our Tarikh and our Sira and our Hadith were all written on papyrus, which are these interlocking leaves. And they disintegrate within 100 years. Okay, they get dry and they crinkle away. That's not the case for the Muslims. Are you hearing this, Abdul? That's not the case for you guys, because you were in the caliphal courts. You were in the richest land in the world, the richest place. Therefore, you did not use papyrus. You would have used parchment or vellum, animal skins. If that were so, then those extant manuscripts still be available today. We should still see them. Where are they, Abdul? I'm picking on him because Raymond Ibrahim's not here today. You can go and shake your hands of Ibrahim. You're taking on his place for him. And that's what we need to ask Muslims. Where are these original manuscripts for the Sira, for the Hadith, for the Tafsir, for the Tarikh, for all of these references that you're talking about, and including the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. Now the Sahaba and the Tabi'un, the Sahaba would be the companions of the Prophet, okay? The equivalent that we would have would be Matthew and John. They were the companions of Jesus. They were right there watching what Jesus did and hearing what Jesus said. So they would be our Sahaba. The Tabi'un were those who got it from the Sahaba. So they would be like Mark and Luke, who got it from the eyewitnesses. Okay, so two different generations. First generation would be the companions. The second were those who got it from the companions. Okay, so we have the same equivalent in Christianity, right? So Muslims are saying that we do have the Sahaba and we do have the Tabi'un. Are you ready? So we have spent 2 years. What I'm going to show you now, no one's seen yet, okay? This is 2 years worth of study. We decided to find out where these manuscripts are. No one has done this work until we did it. And it's just coming out of Europe right now, so you're getting it. Here we go. So the Sahaba, the eyewitnesses or the companions of the Prophet in the Tabi'un, those who received what they knew from the Sahaba. What we're told by Muslims is that there are many Sahaba. Actually, they only list about 5 of them in the Tabi'un. They were writing in the 7th and the 8th century. This is a lie. You ready? Let's see who they quote. These are the ones they quote. Muwatta of Ibn Malik. It comes not from the 7th century, it comes from the 9th century. The Sahifa of Haman bin Munabi, it does not come from the 7th century, it comes from the 12th century. That's 500 years later. The Musnad of Ibn Hanbal, it comes from the 13th century, that's 600 years later. It comes from the Musnad of Abdul Razak, that's 600 years later, along with the Musnad of Al-Tailisi, that's 1300 century, that's 600 years later, and Abid Shaiba, that's 600 years later. Not one of these are from the 7th and 8th century. All of that has been a lie. And we didn't know that until the last 2 years, because we assumed that they had the manuscripts. They have no manuscripts for any of these guys. These documents were all supposedly created in the 7th century, that's what Muslims tell us, yet they do not begin to appear until the 9th to the 13th century, thus 200 to 600 years too late. This suggests that they were all written by others hundreds of years later. Consequently, they are all redacted attributions. Now, let's put that on a timeline, show you what I'm talking about. So when the Muslims, when you come up and they say, we know where the Sahaba and where the Tabi'un, they're looking at these 5, 6 guys right here. That's where they put them, right up next to Muhammad there. None of them come from there. The first one, the earliest one is Ibn Malik, that's from the 9th century. Then you have Munabi, 12th century. You have Hanbal, 13th century, along with Razak. And then you have Tailisi, and then you have Ibn Shaiba. All of them are 12th and 13th century. Can you see the problem, folks? Therefore, the Sahaba and the Tabi'un, they are not first and second generations. They are not eyewitnesses. Our equivalent would be Matthew and John. Yet they were written 200 to 600 years later and simply redacted back to the 7th and 8th century. Thus, they are probably fraudulent. Now, since we started introducing this onto Fander Films, which I started doing this spring, the Muslims are coming back and saying, aha, Mr. Smith, yes, but we have the Musnad, the Muwatta of Ibn Malik. The Muwatta of Ibn Malik is 9th century. Have you heard them say this? Maybe you haven't, but Abdul, you've been saying it a lot of times. You caught me on this a week ago. And you've been hammering me on this. What about the Muwatta Ibn Malik? You see, that's 9th century. That's 9th century, you say. That's only 200 years after Muhammad. Okay, let's go back and see if that's true. Let's take a look. There is a partial copy of the Muwatta in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. It is described as the second third of a celebrated treatise on the Islamic jurisprudence and is dated 890. I will give you that, Abdul. But here's the problem. When does the Muwatta get finalized? It does not. The complete manuscript from the Muwatta does not get finalized until 1030. That's the 11th century. So you really have nothing earlier than the 11th century. What's more, as of today, 1030 manuscript is the earliest fully extant copy of Ibn Malik's work. But here's the problem. Who cares? Ibn Malik has nothing to do with Muhammad. Has nothing to do with the origins of Islam. Ibn Malik is nothing more than about the rules of jurisprudence. It's nothing about the origin. He's just talking about the rules that existed in the 9th and 10th and 11th century. So why is he even in this discussion? Do you see the problem? You're using the wrong genre, Abdul. Sorry. I know you're going to have a hard time after this. We'll go to dinner together and I'll pay for your meal. Now, knowing that, since we know that, let's relook at the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. Let's put them on a timeline. So Abdul and Raymond and the other Muslims, they claim that they're all hugged up against Muhammad. No, they're not. They first put the Muwatta of Ibn Malik is there, but we now know that he's not there. Actually, he is here. So goodbye to Ibn Malik. He doesn't belong there, and similarly the others. So really, they don't begin to appear until the 11th century. So everything we know about these Sahaba or these Tabi'un do not come from the 7th and 8th century. They come from the 11th to the 13th century. That's 400 to 600 years too late. And this is the first time you're hearing that. What about the Sira? What about the biography? What about this book right here? What about this biography of Muhammad? We've been told that it comes from Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham. And that's the classic book that you will get whenever you go to school. That's the book you have to read. Everybody has to read that book. You recognize it, don't you? And you've always trusted it, haven't you? Until today. Who wrote that book? Well, it's right there on the cover. The name's right there. Rasul Allah, the Sira Rasul Allah written by Ibn Ishaq. Do you have any manuscript from Ibn Ishaq? No. So when you open up the pages of that book and you read the introduction, it's very clear that Ibn Ishaq had nothing to do with that book. In fact, it all comes from Ibn Hisham. That's what it says. But here's the problem. We don't have any manuscript from Ibn Hisham. So who actually wrote that book that you read and that everybody reads today? You want to know? You ready? This old gentleman right here wrote it. Heinrich Ferdinand Wustenfeld, a German scholar who between 1858 and 1860 compiled the biography of Muhammad. He then published it in 1860. That's 160 years ago, and everybody in the world now knew who Muhammad was. Therefore, the man who Muslims are dependent on, and same with you, Abdul, and Raymond who's listening, are dependent on to know who their prophet is or what he did, is an elderly German linguist who wrote Muhammad's story 160 years ago, thus over 1,000 years too late.
This is unbelievable. And people still believe in this constructed prophet and base their life values on him. Muslims all over the world need to see this.
Did you not know this? Is this the first time you're hearing this? I talked about this over a year ago. So where did he get his material from? That's the next question. Where did he get his material from? You just need to read his notes. Look at his notes. He explains where he gets it from. He goes to 6 different manuscripts. Are you ready? These are the 6 manuscripts he goes to. He does not go to these 2 guys. This is the one he should have gone to, Ibn Hisham and al-Waqidi. He goes to, there he is right there, he went to this manuscript in Fez in Morocco, dated to 1063, and another manuscript that comes from the British Library that's there today, that's dated from 1278, another one that comes from the Bodleian Library in Oxford, that's 1300s, and another one that comes from Dublin in Ireland, that is the 1300s as well, and then another one that cocomes from the BNF, the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris in Paris, that is 1400, and the one he used the most comes from the School of Oriental African Studies there in London, and it comes from 1589. Those are the 6 manuscripts he uses. Notice 5 of them are in Europe, 1 of them's in Morocco, and the one in Morocco he only used 25% of because he didn't trust the other 75%. So none of this comes from anybody named Ibn Hisham or al-Waqidi. They were all written from the 11th to the 16th century. So goodbye, we don't need you guys anymore. Therefore, every Western and Muslim scholar believes that the Sira compilation was just 200 to 300 years after Muhammad, which is bad enough. Won't they be surprised when they find that they are really much later, between the 11th and 19th century, in other words, between 400 to 1200 years after Muhammad, written by a German scholar. So, who really created the 9th century and the 10th century Hadith? Now, Muslims will say that they were all created by, well, we know who they were created by: Bukhari, Muslim, Dawud, Tirmidhi, Majah, and Nisai, all from the 9th century, right? And one from the 10th century. No. That is what they tell us. No, they're all lying. Abu Dawud is from the 11th century, that's 400 years after Muhammad. An-Nasai is from the 12th century, that's 500 years. Ibn Majah is from the 13th century, that's 600 years. Jami at-Tirmidhi is from the 14th century, that's 700 years. Same with Sahih Muslim, the second most authoritative, comes from the 14th century, and Sahih Bukhari, the most authoritative one, the one that gives us 9 volumes, comes from the 14th and 15th century, that's 700 to 800 years after Muhammad. Folks, not one of these hadith were compiled in the 9th and 10th century. Their final extant manuscripts were not created, were not created until the 11th to the 15th century, which is 400 to 800 years later. Thus, not one of them ever heard a word of Muhammad said. This is the first time you're hearing it. Let's put it on a timeline. So that's what they say. They were all written there by those men in the 9th and 10th century. No, they weren't. They start to appear by Ibn Dawud in the 11th century, Nasai in the 12th century, Majah in the 13th century, 14th century for Al-Tirmidhi, same with Sahih Muslim, and the most important, Al-Bukhari, is not till the 14th and 15th century. Goodbye, don't need those guys anymore. Which means that everything we have about what Muhammad said comes from 400 to 800 years too late. How can you defend him? Now we come and the Tarikh and the Tafsir. Now we've been told that the Tarikh and the Tafsir were written by this guy here, Al-Tabari, and then there are many that come after, Zamakhshari, Suyuti, and Badawi, and the others. But he is the first to write down everything that Islam needs. In fact, everybody loves Al-Tabari because he tells you everything about how you're to walk, talk, eat, drink, sleep, and he tells you all kinds of messed up stuff, and he contradicts himself here and there and gives you the chance to choose what you want. That's why everybody loves Al-Tabari. He was living in the 10th century, so we're told. No, we have nothing from him in the 10th century at all, not a thing. So where do we get Al-Tabari's material from? It was edited by a man named Michael Jean de Geuge, the professor of Arabic at Leiden University in Holland between 1879 and 1901, and is known as the Leiden edition. He went to two manuscripts written in the 13th century, which still exist today in Istanbul. These Arabic manuscripts, these were all written 600 years later, but he didn't put them together and compile them for the whole world to use until the last century. A Dutch scholar. So even Al-Tabari's Tarikh and Tafsir are not 10th century originals, but are much later 13th century compilations, which were merely attributed back to Al-Tabari 300 years earlier, yet they are still 600 years too late. What's more, it took a Dutch scholar from Europe to compile them 1,200 years later. Why didn't the Muslims do this? Because the Muslims never wasted time doing this. They had no idea what Al-Tabari said until the last century. Isn't that amazing? And yet Muslims, and Raymond says this is more historically attributable than any other piece of man, any other person. So I'm going to put everything on one screen. You ready? Let's put them all together on one screen. Really get you confused. So let's start with the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. That's when they say they're put up there. That's when they believe that they actually were written. No, we now know that they were written here. Well, no, let's put them away because that's actually the 11th century and the 12th century and the 13th century and the 13th and the 13th and the 13th again. So goodbye to those guys. The Sahaba and Tabi'un never wrote a thing. So we now know, what about the Hadith? Well, they were telling us that the 6 Hadith were written there. No, they weren't. They were actually written in the 11th, in the 12th, the 14th, and the 15th century. So goodbye to those guys. We don't need them anymore because none of the Hadith were written that early. And then we're told that the Sira was written by those two guys, Hisham and Waqidi, in the 9th century. No, according to our German scholar, looking at his manuscripts, they all start to appear in the 11th and the 13th and the 14th century. And then up into the 15th and the 16th century, written by this guy here, put together and compiled by this German scholar. So goodbye to Waqidi and to Ibn Hisham. And then we're told that the Tafsir and the Tarikh were written in the 11th century by Al-Tabari. No, they weren't. They actually came from 2 manuscripts that are Istanbul, but put together by this Dutch scholar. So goodbye to Al-Tabari, which means, when you look at this, notice, Muslims claim that everything happened 200 to 300 years after Muhammad, right? No, it didn't. What we now know is that everything happened not 200 to 300, 400 to 900 years after Muhammad. We put a big X in the area that they claim is. So we've been told that the stories surrounding Muhammad's life were written by those who saw and heard him, thus by eyewitnesses or by others within a few generations. Yet we see above that everything we know about Muhammad was originally written 400 to 900 years after he presumably lived, yet not canonized into written text until 12 to 1270 years later, suggesting it is all a fraud. Let me put them all up there. That's what you can give to Muslims. Just get that piece, take that picture, get this PowerPoint, get that picture, and then just give it to your Muslim friends. They've got to come up with an answer to that. Looking at this timeline above, how can Raymond Ibrahim suggest that the history of Muhammad is one of the best supported in history? How can he say that when those who wrote it did so a full 400 to 900 years after he presumably lived? And what's more, what will he do with the fact that much of it was not canonized into written form until 12 to 1270 years later? Is this the best in history? Are you listening to this, Abdul? You're kind of losing your smile, aren't you? It's getting harder and harder, isn't it? I love that. He's got a great smile. Now, as a comparison, folks, be careful. We as Christians have done the same thing. We're just as guilty. You know we are. You know the Gnostic Gospels, 52 found in the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt, written in Coptic, purporting to tell stories of Jesus' childhood, yet were all written in the 4th century and redacted back to the 1st century. But for instance, the Gospel of Thomas, that's the one, Muslims love that one, and the Gospel of Judas, written around the 2nd century, but attributed by their authors to have been written by the disciples of Jesus Christ's time. Look at the Gospel of Barnabas, the favorite of Muslims. The favorite gospel by the Muslims was written in 1634 AD, but was attributed to the companion of Paul in the 1st century. They were all written in order to give credibility and authority for those who wrote them. So this practice of redaction and attribution is common in every religion, including Christianity. But here's the difference. Here's the difference. Listen to this, Abdul. And Raven, if you're watching. The difference is that while the later Muslim traditions are all considered authoritative, as you see on that graph that I put up there, the later Christian traditions are all considered fraudulent. That's why we don't read the Gospel of Thomas. That's why we don't read the Gospel of Judas. That's why we throw out the Gospel of Barnabas. Why? Because they are all written too late. So we throw out that which is written too late, and the Muslims do just the opposite. They hold on and take the latest material and throw out that which has gone earlier. Do you see the problem? So we aren't doing the same thing. We do just the opposite of what the Muslims do. So what does all this mean? I'm not saying and suggesting that there never was someone called Ibn Hisham or Al-Waqidi or Al-Bukhari or Sahih Muslim or even Al-Tabari. I'm not saying that. Please don't get that from me today. I'm not saying that, because someone certainly had to have created those names somewhere. These men could very well have lived, and they could very well have lived in the 9th and 10th century where they're attributed. Thomas, Judas, and Barnabas did actually live. They were actual people. They were real men who were historical characters in the early church and well respected. And that was why the later compilers attributed their works to them. But they did not write the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Barnabas. That's all I'm saying. In the same token, neither did Al-Waqidi or Ibn Hisham or Al-Bukhari or Muslim or Al-Tabari write what is purported to have been written by them, because we have nothing from those men. Similarly, that is why I believe later Muslims attributed the stories back to these earlier men. Consequently, what Muslims today contend these historical writers wrote, they have no support for historically. They have no evidence whatsoever, since they have little to nothing of what they wrote outside of the Muwatta, which is not even a member of the Islamic tradition, so it should not even be in this discussion. All that Muslims can now be certain of is what the later Abbasids and even the early Ottomans believe happened in the 7th and 8th century, since everything that had been written earlier had been destroyed and then replaced with completely new stories to fit a new agenda. Conclusion: when compared to Christianity, which has manuscript evidence within the 1st century, Islam is much less historically supported, contrary to what Raymond contends. Yet it shouldn't be, considering how recent it is, supposedly was created, and all of it written on vellum, on animal skin. They should have the best material, but they don't.
Over the first 4 parts of this series, Dr. Smith has meticulously shown how the historical evidence for Prophet Muhammad and Islam does not add up. There are more holes in the standard Islamic narrative than we thought. The earliest Islamic manuscripts begin to appear 400 to 600 years after the supposed prophet was said to have died. No wonder he concluded that the story about the prophet must have been a product of fabrications to create a religion to unite an emerging empire. Whatever you think, Dr. Smith's work highlights how the historical foundations of the Hadith and even the traditional story of Muhammad face serious challenges when placed under academic scrutiny. By questioning the reliability of the authors, the late compilation of the texts, and the inconsistencies in the narrative, he opens the door for deeper reflection on the origins of Islam itself. We have traced some of his strongest points and now invite you to weigh the evidence critically. In the end, history demands honesty, and only by examining these sources closely can we truly understand the roots of faith and truth. Watch out for Part 5, where Dr. J compares the historical evidence for Muhammad to that of Jesus Christ to finally shut down the history of Islam.